Right, so welcome to Dysfunction Mapping version 2. This is the new template that's on Miroverse, and I wanted to give everyone a bit of a walkthrough on how this new template works and how dysfunction mapping itself works, because a lot of people may be seeing it here for the first time. If you are already a dysfunction mapping practitioner, obviously some of this is going to be familiar to you, but for now, we're just going to focus in on how this works inside the new structure. So, for those who are new here, welcome. Dysfunction mapping is a tool that I created during my decade as a coach and as a leader to help me better understand the problems that were going on in the organizations I'm trying to help, and hopefully to come up with real experiments and measurable impacts that I can have that can actually be seen and understood by the people around me. And so dysfunction mapping goes through 5 basic steps. And you can see on the framework here that we're going to walk through in a lot of detail. We have symptoms that begin on the right, which are the high level problems, issues, and pain points that people are reporting. These are essentially the things that we want to resolve in our organization. But in order to get there, we want to identify the dysfunction that comes underneath these things. This often can be considered like a root cause, although there's often not a single root cause for these things. What we're really just looking for is a force multiplier. What is a thing that we are doing or not doing that we think could explain many of these symptoms so that we can try to address that dysfunction and have a large impact on a large number of pain points? That then connects over to purpose, which is where we define our unified reason for solving this problem so that we can all pull in the same direction and have alignment on running this experiment. This connects to solution, which is our explicit action that we're going to take, our concrete thing that we can do to try to fulfill that purpose. And then finally, measure, which is, of course, the most important part. It's how do we measure if our solution has had the impact we wanted it to have? Have we solved our symptoms? And do we actually have some way of measuring that we've had an impact on this organization? Now, of course, this is something that you can use in many different domains. My experience primarily is working with product delivery teams, but of course, anyone that is working on complex creative work, you're probably going to get some value from going through this approach. But I just want to walk through kind of what this looks like so that we can get a little bit of guidance from the template and you can hopefully try this for yourself. So essentially, we start by gathering symptoms, right? Talking to people in our organization, in our teams, and figuring out what pain points really seem to matter. And on this template, you can actually scroll down here and see a bunch of cards that will help gamify this process a little bit, make it easier for you to decide what you're going to do at each given step. And so when we're gathering symptoms, we have these prompts down here that give us questions we can ask of ourselves. Things like who is arguing and why? What tools are we missing? Who is missing when we need them, right? These are questions that we can ask of ourselves. They're questions that we can ask of our team, or they're even questions that we can ask of our stakeholders. But by asking these questions, we'll hopefully hear about challenges and pain points, things that we'd call symptoms, that we would note on our stickies and put into this part of our dysfunction map over here. And over time, these are going to build into a relatively large list. You're probably going to have some overlaps and some double ups. So you will need to decide how you want to cultivate that over time. But the goal is to get to a point where we have a reasonable number of symptoms that we can start working through. And that leads us to our next stage, which is essentially a form of affinity mapping. And so there's a little bit of extra guidance in the new version of this tool to make this a little bit easier with these little black hole representations to kind of demonstrate that there's something at the middle and the symptoms are sort of attracted to them. And we can start either going straight to dysfunctions if we think we know enough to identify a potential root cause. But if we need a little bit of help getting there, we've now got these new theme cards. For example, here you can see we can't respond fast enough to market changes. It takes forever for code to get reviewed, and we have long release cycles. These symptoms all seem to relate to this idea of speed and responsiveness. So we'll put that in the center. That might help us to identify which symptoms we might pull into it. But we might also work in reverse. We might pull a bunch of symptoms together and then figure out which theme we think is at the center. Now, again, you don't have to do this step. You can ignore themes entirely, but it might just help you to get your thoughts together, especially if you're working with multiple people to think through this problem. Now, on the back of the theme cards, you've got a bit of extra information. What does this actually mean? Symptoms relating to a feeling of slow progress and a lack of responsiveness. Cool, that makes sense. But it also gives us some examples of commonly related dysfunctions. So this might be caused by work items being too large. It might be caused by blind handoffs or complex processes. So those are all dysfunctions or underlying issues that might be causing some of our symptoms. So Once we've identified that, we can decide, do we want to identify one of those dysfunctions as a hypothesis of something we think could cause this? Or maybe we come up with something else. That's entirely up to you. There are no right answers here. This is just about coming up with our experiment that we're going to run to find out how these things are connected. But in this case, we've connected it to the work items are too large dysfunction, because I think in this organization, if we were to break our work items down to be smaller packets and easier things to deliver and to learn from, it would solve probably all of these symptoms. I don't know for sure, so I have to run the experiment. Now, in order to do that, we need to first build some alignment. So we go to our purpose step. And our purpose step is where we come up with our agreed purpose, our reason for doing what we're doing, so that we can all pull in the same direction. And for that, we have purpose prompts. So, for example, this one here that says, how will things improve through our action? That just help us come up with a little statement that acts as our North Star. So we want to break work into smaller pieces so that delivering value is easier and releases are less stressful. That's something the whole team can get behind, that we've all agreed is something that we want to spend some time and energy on. And of course, that will help inform our next step, which is our solution. So the solution step is the same as it's always been. It's deciding on a concrete action that I can take that will potentially fulfill that purpose and therefore resolve that dysfunction. Now, the extra guidance that we have here now under the solution cards give us, for example, things like a game is a mechanism that we could use to help fulfill our purpose. And by flipping that over, I can see some examples. Could I run a game to help the purpose to be filled? Is there a game that might help people to understand or solve the problem? Or what games exist that help teach the concepts that relate to our purpose? So in this case, the concept of breaking down large ideas or initiatives. So from that, we might decide, cool, we're going to run a workshop on breakdown practices, on the spider method, and see if that helps fulfill our purpose. And if it does, we believe that that might help solve our dysfunction and, of course, alleviate those symptoms. Now, there's a bunch of different solution cards based on things like mechanisms and values. You can see ones on stances like facilitator, on events like sprint planning. All of these exist just as random cards that you can pull in to apply to your purpose and say, hey, could this be a tool that we could use to create a concrete plan of action? Again, all of this is just about getting more quickly to an experiment that you can run. It's not about finding right or wrong answers. But once you've done that, you then get on to our final step, which is measure. And of course, this gives us our place to figure out, have we actually impacted the symptoms that we wanted to impact? I call this step closing the loop, because what we're really trying to do is go back to the beginning and say, hey, how would I measure if these things have improved, the things that people cared about, the big cluster of issues that we've tied together? And so we then have some of these other cards, right? So the trend card gives us an example of one way that we might capture some new information. And so, for example, I could look for a code review average time change, or I could look for a change in lead time, which would help us with our market response, or even use the time since counter to see how long has it been since our last deployment failure. And all of these will help in this case for our purpose of breaking work into smaller pieces and making our releases less stressful. If this has the impact it has, we should be able to measure things. And that's essentially the end of the process, right? This defines our experiment that we can now run. We've got a few options. We might choose one of these things to run, see how it impacts our measures. And we can share this entire dysfunction map with our organization. But another bonus step that you might find useful is converting these ideas into Kanban items that you can then put on a board, measure, how long they've been in progress. You can do all the things that you can do with a Kanban board, but obviously do that with these little items where you can, of course, record things like the purpose, the measures, and the symptoms that you're trying to impact. And a lot of that can be very, very useful when you don't want to swamp someone by showing them all of the information in a dysfunction map, but just want to give them the cliff notes of what experiments you're running and the impacts that you're hoping to have. So that's the high level of how the new dysfunction mapping board works. Of course, you've got the entire new sets of cards, which with this new functionality now have more information than ever before. And you can use the new functionality to put these into a pile and even shuffle them so you can draw them at random, which makes this a really interesting way to gamify the approach of coming up with your experiments. So hopefully at a high level, that explains how dysfunction mapping works and some of the changes in the new version. But the thing I would encourage is for you to basically just go in and give it a try for yourself. Copy this template from the Miroverse, have a play with it with your teams, see what ideas you can come up with, and of course, reach out to me if you'd like any help with running any of these sorts of workshops. Good luck.